Hey, I know I'm moderating a panel later, but I like to get involved. So, real quick, if we took away all the constitutional rights of corporations, including property rights, all the ones that were listed, is it possible that we could reinsert those through legislative rights, or some, which have been mentioned, at the state level, et cetera? Or is there something unforeseen, devastating about that? Is there a reason why we couldn't give them just legislative rights?
Okay, so that's one question. Just do you know who's going to answer that among you? Do you want to choose it, or not now, but just so that you know that you're answering?
I'll answer it.
But not.
Well, no,
okay.
the chip.
Okay.
Yeah.
She's got that one.
Hello. My question is, corporations have fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. That limits their ability to have a conscience in other matters. So I'm wondering if there's some way to craft something that would attack that would limit the personhood, due to the fact that the personhood is already limited by that constraint. Thanks.
Okay, Lynn's got that one. Okay.
Right. Question is there an overlap between the functionalist approach that Lynn Stout was talking about, and specifically in regard to publicly owned corporations, and the argument that Professor Lessig was presenting in regard to the corruption of the Constitution? And underlying that, is there any specific corporations that share that overlap?
Norway enabled quotas for gender equality in the 1980s for political parties, and it proved effective, and they didn't need to renew the quotas. Is there any way gender quotas in political reform can be incentivized by campaign finance towards equity and governance?
Maybe this is a form of Chenk's question, but I was wondering if there's a legal distinction between rights and privileges, and whether the concept that corporations have privileges that come through their charter, and so that really is through the legislative process that we grant these privileges, is different than talking about rights. I've heard that distinction made, and I'm not sure that I totally understand it, and I hope you guys do.
Thanks, Mary Beth. Who's got that one? Okay. All right.
Hi, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, but I'm unsettled because I haven't heard the fraudulent claims that mentioned here today. To me, what is a little bit of devil's advocate here, what is most disturbing about what big money does is when it combines with fraudulent claims. Take an example of Proposition 37, for example. I don't want to say much about that, but could we possibly today include that in a very major way when we're talking about big money and dark money? It's not just the big money, it's what the big money is doing with its money. Thank you.
So the question on false advertising.
Okay. Yeah, looking at this last slide, I just get worried of the shift of money from super PACs, if it does include associations, into the chambers of commerce or ALEC.
I'll take that one. And the last one from this room.
Yeah, very quickly. Is the statement that someone made almost parenthetically that the corporations have fiduciary responsibility to stakeholders, it has become, I think, accepted common wisdom that that's the only responsibility they have. That is a myth, is it not? And could someone speak to that? Thank you.
I was going to cover that.
So, we had a multitude of questions from the other room. Thank you, the other room. But let me just pose those to the panel as well. One question was, can anyone speak to the issue of what other Western nations do in their elections in terms of allowing corporations? All right. Yeah. And the second question that I've chosen out of this set is how can a 28th Amendment deal with the revolving door of government and lobbying, the issue that Professor Lessig raised? Is there a way to deal with that? So we've had these questions. We're just going to start to try to answer some of them.
Should I go first? The first question we had was, if we're concerned about the loss of protections to corporations, couldn't they be provided legislatively? And the answer is certainly they could. You could have wonderful laws enacted that gave all the protection to corporations or associations that we thought they should have. The question is just, do we trust our legislators to do that? The purpose of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights was out of a fundamental distrust that you could count on the legislators to steer a straight and narrow course. So certainly, if you remove constitutional protections from corporations, that doesn't automatically make everything go to, heck in a handbasket. It's really a question of what laws are enacted by the legislatures if there's no recourse to the Constitution.
Yeah, I'd like to just speak to what is indeed a very common but incorrect belief that corporations have a legal duty to maximize share value. That's actually not correct. I know I just wrote a book on it called The Shareholder Value Myth. A better way, which I got a plug in for just now, but a much better way to understand corporations is that they're not things that are owned by shareholders that have to maximize shareholder wealth. They're much more analogous to nation states or other very complex entities. So they control all of these assets, but they also involve the participation of many different stakeholders that have a variety of governance rights. So shareholders do get to vote for directors, but in public corporations, shareholders are so dispersed, it's a very weak right. When companies approach insolvency, it's not uncommon for creditors to get voting rights. Consumers obviously get voting rights in the sense they don't have to buy the products. Employees get a lot of input. So it's more valuable, I think, to think of them as these very complex institutions that have a lot of stakeholders participating in them. I actually think that's the good news. And I think that with appropriate disclosures, what you can expect is that the involvement of these different human interest groups in corporations, including shareholders, consumers, rank and file employees, and sometimes even the CEOs and directors. I've actually known CEOs and directors to express concern for society's well-being. I've seen it happen. But it can't happen when we have these, it can't happen when political expenditures are going on in darkness and these various human contributors don't know what's going on, which is why I'm very excited about Chiara's project, but I was also urging her in between. I said, you've got to expand it to include the private companies. The public corporations already are voluntarily, I just looked it up, 60% of Fortune 100 companies already make pretty extensive disclosure of their political contributions. It's not perfect, but because of the pressure of these stakeholder groups, they're already making some voluntary disclosure. If we can't get the sunlight to shine on the private companies and the private associations, we won't have solved the problem.
Okay.
I just wanted to add one thing to what Lynn was saying about, or actually what Barbara was saying about, would we be sufficiently protected if legislation were enough to take care of corporate rights? And there's one area in which I think it sort of brings the question to a head, and that is the Fifth Amendment eminent domain clause that requires compensation for takings of property for public use. If you didn't allow nonprofit, or for that matter for-profits, to rely on the eminent domain clause, there's always the possibility that Congress or one of the state legislatures could, in some great distress, such as during World War II when the auto companies were ordered to stop making cars and make only tanks and airplanes, to essentially nationalize or confiscate an industry. And if the corporations that have had the right to insist on just compensation and eminent domain no longer had that recourse, then we could, at least theoretically, probably wouldn't happen very often, be in a situation where a legislative act to take private corporate property would not have any backstop, any constitutional resource to create any other outcome other than that. Now, in my Sandinista days, it sounds pretty good.
Okay, let me respond just a bit to the voluntary disclosure point. So thank goodness for Bruce Freed. He has basically single-handedly orchestrated shareholders to ask their corporations to be more transparent, and thank goodness for that. But it is voluntary, which means the moment they get burned because of a particular disclosure, they have the ability to shut up like a clam. And so that's why I think we need regulations at the SEC we need laws from Congress, and we need laws in states. I do not trust corporations to self-regulate in this area. The other question was, what do other democracies do? And I've done extensive work on what happens in the UK. I think of the UK as almost the bizarro America in terms of how they deal with their elections, because where we have gone this way, they have gone that way. So, for example, they call elections with very little notice, which means that you have an election period that only lasts for a couple of weeks compared to the 2-year saga that we have here. They don't allow television advertising. It's a totally different system. But one of the things that's very similar between the UK and the US are our capital markets. And under the UK Companies Act, which they amended in 2000, it requires both disclosure and consent. So the corporations that spend in politics in the UK disclose down to the pence how much money they spent and where they spent it. And then secondly, they get shareholder approval of corporate political budgets 1 to 4 years in advance. And if the managers don't win that shareholder vote, they can't spend that money.
As to the question about rights versus privileges, well, that's a complex question that legal theorists have been debating for a very long time. Hofeld pops to mind, privileges, rights, and duties, but I don't think that's probably what you were asking about. In this context, I would say this is a complicated question, but I think in broad strokes, privileges is usually used in the language of talking about state charters to form a corporation, that states have the prerogative to have a corporation code and allow people to form corporations. And then once you do form a corporation, you have those characteristics of the corporation incidental that I talked about, the right to contract in the corporate name and sue and be sued and hold property in the contract in the corporate name. And then as to rights, generally speaking, I think that comes up in the discussion of how do we treat corporations under the US Constitution and how do we talk about individuals acting in association. And there, I think we're generally thinking about rights as against the government.
And then I think we had a question on false advertising, or the equivalent of regulating the false advertising, in addition to the notion of whether there should be political advertising in the way it happens in the US compared to other countries. But one of the efforts that Congress has engaged in was the effort to basically have you take ownership of that ad. So you have to disclose at the end of the ad, every candidate does, this ad is brought to you by Barack Obama or Mitt Romney. I stand behind this ad. That's not happening in the nonprofit world. Even, and I would say beyond the C4 groups, the public welfare groups, but also the C3 groups that are running the issue ads. These are groups where an organization, an entity can get a tax deduction for giving to the C3 organization. The C3 organization can run there's been an enormous amount of activity, increasing activity that we've documented at PR Watch. And there really is very little accountability about the truth of those ads. In fact, I would submit to you that they're almost always misleading. You know that. They're almost always misleading. But I think there has been a real reluctance from the Congress and from the judiciary to try to regulate truth in politics in that sense. And I think that there's a lot of obstacles to doing so. But one approach would be to require that sort of disclosure that would make someone held accountable if they are the liar behind that ad. If Sheldon, for example, had backed that ad in his own name, what would be the consequences for him or his corporation if it was in his own name and it was deceitful? That's one approach. However, there is an effort afoot by the people who have brought to you these decisions, James Bopp and the lawyers for the Wisconsin Right to Life and other groups, to basically suggest that because money is speech in this vernacular, disclosure chills speech. And the thing you cannot do is chill speech. And we've actually been litigating before the courts in DC about this question of whether you can get disclosure and whether, and in essence, whether disclosure will be claimed to be in violation of the free speech rights of people who want anonymity. So there are some real issues there beyond the fact that groups like Citizens United itself have described themselves as press, beyond regulation. And so there are very complicated issues. Let me say with respect, and that I think goes to the question of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and ALEC and other groups. ALEC doesn't actually play in elections that way. But the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, it is the case that we have a shell game operation happening in essence where corporations are giving to one group that gives to another group that gives to another group. And you cannot uncloak it through ordinary investigative means, although we do, and our hard work and others do their hard work on that. But let me just wrap up this by saying two quick things. There are regulatory measures that have been proposed, and Greg Colvin has been working on some of those with respect to the IRS in terms of the types of groups who are nonprofits and how they can allocate their money to activity that is not disclosed but clearly is designed to influence the elections. And so, Greg, I wanted to make sure that you could mention that beyond what I've just mentioned. And then I just want to say there are questions from OWS, who's been tremendous in moving forward the idea of money out, voters in, and a lot of questions we didn't get to. And I hope that with Mary Beth's help and others, we can have an online conversation that continues to debate these. And so let me just give Greg the last word.
Well, just two thoughts on relevant legislative changes, or for that matter, IRS regulation changes. First of all, as some of you may know, 501c4 and C6 groups could spend up to 49% of their total money in a year for political influence. This is how the IRS appears to treat the question of what is a secondary activity. So if your primary activity, 51% of what you're spending is lobbying or for some sort of social benefit, then you could shelter as much as 49% of your total budget in a year for for explicit ads favoring or opposing candidates. I published a blog suggesting that be lowered to something like 5 or 10%. So that's one thing. Another is that we are laboring, at least in the tax-exempt world, under a very vague facts and circumstances test about what is and is not a political communication or political intervention. And as a result of that, you see these sort of sham issue ads that don't have express advocacy in them. But the IRS doesn't have clear rules for when you cross the line. And I actually chair a drafting committee that is working now under the leadership of Public Citizen to propose to the IRS a good set of regulations, as we have for lobbying, which would define that line between what's partisan and what is nonpartisan. And that would create a level playing field and a good set of rules that allow the IRS to become the umpire that it should in terms of tax-exempt groups and be able to distinguish between what is speech intended to influence an election versus that is simply informing the public.
Well, please join me in giving a hand to our experts.